Welcome to the Sunshine Link, your source of recorded activities for senior care. Our purpose is to provide you with meaningful and engaging activities that span a wide variety of interests, from music to physical activity to world history to sharing memories. We hope that this brings some sunshine to your day.
Hello, my name is Barry Torch, and I'm a historian of the Renaissance in Italy. And when I say that, people immediately follow up with, well, what is the Renaissance in Italy? And that's a very difficult question to answer, which is why I'm here today. The Renaissance, as I define it at least, is a period of human history, at least in Europe, stretching from around 1300 to 1700, and it was largely a cultural movement that started in Italy and moved outwards from there over the period of 400 years. One of the reasons that the Renaissance is so difficult to talk about is because no one really knows how to define it, when it began, when it ended, or what was really important about it. Let's take an example. The famous poet from before the Black Death, Francesco Petrarca, or Petrarch, lived in the mid to late 1300s. He lived before and after the Black Death, and he wrote a lot of poetry, especially a very famous poem called Mia Italia, My Italy. Let's take another Renaissance figure, William Shakespeare, famous playwright, especially in England. I'm sure you've read some of his plays. These men lived about 300 years apart and would not recognize each other as Renaissance or belonging to the same era. But we call them both Renaissance men. So one of the problems with discussing this idea of a Renaissance at all is because the people in the past spoke about it in very different ways. They spoke about it as being a revival of ancient Rome in their current Italy. They spoke about it as being this process of new art, new culture, new science, and they use the term rebirth, basically believing that there was this ancient world, then there was a period of a lot of darkness that we call the Middle Ages, and then they had a rebirth of everything that was good and Roman, starting around the year 1300. Because they spoke about it, and because they promoted this idea of a rebirth, we see it in the sources, so we talk about the Renaissance as a thing. But talking about this 400-year period as a singular period is like saying we live in the same era as Napoleon. It's very complicated to talk about. One of the things I love about the Renaissance, though, is because it's this period of transformation and this period of quick learning, at least, again, by elite men. It started in Italy because Italy was a very urban society. In the middle of the Middle Ages, when there were lots and lots of rural, small villages, Italy had large cities. Florence, Venice, Rome, Naples, Milan. They all had very rich, powerful cities across Italy. Italy was more urban than basically anywhere else in Europe, except for the Low Countries like Netherlands and Belgium. But because there were all these cities, cities attract trade, cities attract people to come to it. This creates a snowball effect. As cities attract people, the city becomes more and more important, especially culturally and financially. So this attracts even more people to come to the city, which builds and builds and builds and snowballs. As these cities get more and more powerful, surrounded by the ruins of ancient Rome, wealthy merchants and wealthy people who weren't nobles in the city decided they wanted to use all their money to promote themselves, of course, but also their city. So they would spend all this money they were making on great big palaces, art to commemorate themselves, their family, and their cities. They would invest in scholars. They would pay for poetry. They would finance plays. So the Renaissance had to be urban because it was paid for by all these wealthy merchants. One of the greatest triumphs of the Renaissance, invoking all of this new work being done on architecture and science and art, was that a wealthy merchant family, the Medici, paid for the finishing of the great Florentine cathedral, Santa Maria del Fiore, The cathedral was medieval, but it didn't have a roof because they couldn't build a dome big enough. But in the Renaissance, they figured out how to. They built a massive dome over the cathedral there, one of the greatest triumphs of Renaissance architecture. Again, one of the reasons why this is so complicated, though, is because there's this illusion of importance. They create all of this amazing stuff, so they create this idea that, well, all this stuff exists that's amazing, we must be amazing because of it. Ignore those Middle Ages that weren't so amazing. We are the awesome ones now. A good example of this, if you might have seen it, is the portrait of the Mona Lisa by Leonardo da Vinci. Mona Lisa was Lisa Giocondo, the second wife of a wealthy Florentine slave trader and merchant, Francesco Giocondo. We know who she was now. But one of the reasons why I'm bringing attention to this portrait is because it's a stunning portrait, full of naturalism, amazing use of oil painting. Leonardo was an amazing artist. But this is a portrait of a merchant's wife. She wasn't nobility. She wasn't powerful. She was 15 years old at the time. Merchants could afford such beautiful, amazing things. It was a consumer culture. Another really good example is the rebuilding of St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. The building that the church used as its major basilica was an ancient building, 1,000 years old. It was falling apart. Through the Middle Ages, they didn't have the finances to pay for rebuilding the whole thing, so they patched it up as they could, keeping the original Roman building standing. In the Renaissance, they tore down the whole thing and rebuilt it from the ground up. But when they rebuilt it, they made it look Roman. Why? Well, the Roman Empire had this idea of authority and power and greatness. And the people who rebuilt the cathedral wanted to create that idea about themselves. It was the use of this idea of Rome as this great power that they wanted to use for themselves. Another good example of Renaissance culture is the famous book The Prince by Niccolo Machiavelli. One of the most fascinating things about The Prince is that it was dedicated to the Duke of Urbino, another small town in Italy, Lorenzo de' Medici. The Medici family weren't nobility. They were a very wealthy merchant family. They weren't nobility, but because they made so much money, they could work and live and act like nobles. And that's one of the most amazing things about the Renaissance as a whole. 400 years of very quick transformations across art, science, literary culture, political society. All of this was in flux. A question for you is, why did the Renaissance care so much about this idea of Rome? Why did they make ancient Rome and the empire an ideal? Why did they try and cater to it? And why did they reject their past so much? They had this amazing idea of Rome, but then 1,000 years of the Dark Ages. Why did they care so much about Rome? That's a question I want you to think about.
Thank you for joining us at the Sunshine Link. Did you enjoy that activity? If so, we'd love to hear from you. Comment below, make sure to subscribe, and join our email list. We hope this brought some sunshine to your day.